I'm sorry, I'm a bit late for summer. Did you need something? Let me just bustle off my outerwear. Right. Well then, let's talk about the 2008 financial crisis. Hello, Void? Shout back if you can hear me. Because I'm an internet lefty and therefore extremely addicted to nuance, we're gonna start off with a couple of disclaimers. Number one, for someone who oftentimes tries to predict trends on the internet, I'm kind of against, in general, the concept of trends because I think it's a way to encourage consumption and overconsumption, especially in women, as well as, you know, continually just press that boot really hard on the global south and make them do our slave labor. But I also think that macro trends, as in being super large and, you know, all encompassing, are important for defining decades, as well as like the style of certain periods can tell you a lot about the culture. My other disclaimer is there's going to be some talk about economics and markets on here, and I just wanted to say I am a historian and an anthropologist and not at all an economist. I know enough about economics and economic history to talk about it from a person-central cause and effect sort of way when I'm talking about different historical events and how they relate to the economics of the time. But I'm not claiming to be an economist. Hi, Editing SJ here. My original 2008 financial crisis non-economist explanation got a little bit rambly, so I redid it, but I look like garbage. The 2008 financial crisis started the Great Recession of the late 2000s and early 2010s and was a result of a long, weird chain of events that began with big banks offering subprime mortgage loans. So as a result of deregulation by the Bush administration, I believe, subprime mortgage loans were allowed to roll out, and they were loans that banks could give to people or families with lower credit scores to purchase larger, nicer housing. However, the banks figured out they could make money on both ends of this equation, and so they would bundle all of these different mortgages that they were generally fairly sure that the people to whom they'd given them weren't going to pay them back or were not going to have access to ways to pay them back because they were really predatory loans, honestly. And they would sell the bundles of those mortgages to various people, various organizations, but the main organizations to whom they would sell these bundles were organizations that provided pensions. Yep, that's right, pensions for old people. So when the housing bubble, which happened as a result of these loans, and inflated all of the prices for housing beyond their intrinsic value, eventually popped after, you know, everyone kind of started to figure out that no one was paying back these predatory loans. The loans that had been bundled into the pensions of retirees meant that the fundings of these people's life savings would go down just immediately overnight. And so because of that, a lot of people lost a lot of money, and a lot of people were evicted from their homes and lost everything they had. But the United States government decided that the answer was to bail out the banks. Just the banks. Not all of the banks, but some banks and pretty much no regular people. So obviously a lot of people were not particularly happy with that. And as a result of this huge economic downturn and the way that it affected average people to such a greater extent than it affected the wealthy, people began the Occupy movement.
The Occupy movement began in New York with Occupy Wall Street, but soon became worldwide. People moved into financial areas to reclaim the commons, such as the London Stock Exchange, and even built their own libraries there.
Anyway,
Obviously, something that affected the financial markets was going to affect fashion because it is something that people purchase and were purchasing at the time. So because a lot of people had a lot less spare money to spend, the trend McBling from the early 2000s, in which logo mania was kind of everywhere and everything was glittery. Think spring breakers, belly button rings, peak Paris Hilton, was definitely over, because instead of being cool and aspirational, the financial crash had caused McBling to become gaudy and inaccessible. So what replaced it? Well, 2007-ish saw the rise of Bloghouse, which was an underground sort of EDM genre of music made by mostly young people and students with bare bones accessories and spread through MySpace and underground parties. And the style that became associated with Bloghouse was indie sleaze, what we now call indie sleaze, what was kind of called indie or the first iteration of hipster back then. And a lot of it was inspired by 90s grunge, because 20-year trend cycle, 90, 2010, and included a lot of ripped tights, messy makeup, unbrushed, unstyled hair, people like Corey Kennedy just wearing literally anything, whatever. I'll give you a couple of examples. Clothing started to get a lot darker, a lot looser, and a lot less showy offy. The luxury market didn't decline quite so much as the regular sort of consumer clothing market. I think that has to do with the Recession Lipstick Index, which shows that purchases of lipstick actually go up during times of financial strife because people want to have small little luxuries. And so that often took place in some of indie sleaze's little glittery moments that were inspired by the 80s, such as those glittery American Apparel bodysuits, and some designer items such as Miuccia Prada's little gold lame moment going into the financial crisis. So it's not like shiny was 100% out. It just was a little bit in bad taste to walk around wearing a crystal encrusted Juicy Couture tracksuit by that point. So nowadays we're actually experiencing similar but definitely not to the same extent or scale financial issues, and with people unable to afford mortgages or purchase homes, much like the 2008 financial crisis, as well as people often unable to afford such luxuries as blingy or gaudy items. It looks like we can trace our current iterations of fashion down a similar path. Our macro trends are still on this 20-year trend cycle, and so generally raising alarm about how indie sleaze is the next big thing, twee is the next big thing every other week on TikTok is not necessarily reflective of reality. However, this still means that the late 2000s, early 2010s are coming into their introduction phase. Now, everyone on TikTok was talking about indie sleaze for a bit last year, and I've seen a lot of styles that are influenced by it actually coming and trickling a little bit into some of my in-person interactions. I've whipped out the old tights. I've been wearing vests for a while now, but I found secondhand one of those American Apparel bodysuits, and I've been wearing it out like under shorts or jeans, and it's actually super flattering. Like, it's shocking. But in an age where indie sleaze isn't getting the most views as the newest big thing on TikTok, we are seeing frazzled English woman come up as the next micro aesthetic. Now, what is the frazzled English woman? Frazzled English woman was a term coined by the TikToker, whose name I will put up here probably. And it comes from a lot of 2000s sort of romantic movies, and it relates to this idea of a sort of trendy by accident because she doesn't care about the trends lady who's always running late, who's always got somewhere to be. She works like a middle class, lower middle class sort of job, and the frazzled English woman really effortlessly blends lots of different layering, and she's bringing back the scarf, which is great because my grandma got me like a ton of scarves when I was a little kid, and scarves were like super weird to wear at the time, so like I would just walk around with my neck out just freezing. Now, indie sleaze and frazzled English woman being some of the more recent TikTok sort of general aesthetics actually says a lot about our cultural situation and how it compares to the situation surrounding the 2008 financial crisis. Now, though a lot of these movies are from sort of the earlier 2000s, that was during a period in which a lot of more of the McBling and what we consider to be Y2K, as well as a more legitimate and original form of Y2K that actually started in neighbourhoods of colour and was originally considered ghetto by white people, was sort of more at the forefront of style. And after the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of people were looking to what they already owned, and so re-wearing things from that sort of era of when those films came out if they were dressing that way, as well as wearing things that were comfortable and things that helped them with their stress. And I think it's really indicative of how we are feeling as a culture that styles like indie sleaze and the frazzled English woman are sort of coming back into vogue, right? Because both of these styles are styles that allow for an even romanticised tiredness, like being in a rush, being stressed, though indie sleaze style sort of emphasises being tired because you are out partying, whereas the frazzled English woman is just tired because she works. But either way, they de-emphasise looking cleaned up and looking perfect, and as well as looking rich. It's completely fine to look middle class or lower middle class, and they also sort of de-emphasise that idea of perfect skin and perfect makeup that we've really been focusing on in the past couple of years. I know after the 2016 overly made up drag-based sort of Instagram Kardashian makeup style started to fade, we've had a lot of emphasis on skincare because wearing that amount of foundation definitely has ruined my skin, and I don't know about you. That emphasis on skincare, as well as the emphasis on foundation, sort of goes away in both of these aesthetics. Instead, it's considered appropriate to show what your actual face looks like underneath, generally because of an assumption that you didn't have time or you were too busy partying and being cool to really bother with things like that, as well as those wealth signifiers in the form of designer clothes and such we were talking about earlier. Now, this emphasis in a shabbier, rough around the edges style that does call back to the Occupy era is not necessarily one that means that the revolution is coming soon or anything like that. Instead, it sort of indicates a shift in focus that we've seen going on recently between millennials and Gen Z ideals of wealth. Real British person would have said Gen Z. Gen Z is using fashion to sort of reflect a rejection of what we call bootstrap ideology. Now, bootstrap ideology comes from the phrase pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which was actually originally a joke mocking this ideology because it's physically impossible to grab one's own boots and pull one's own self up the sort of social pyramid. However, it became during the 1980s, a time of Reaganomics, an ideal of the American dream and that you can sort of achieve wealth through hard work and success. And that ideology was associated with a lot of slightly old-ish like graphic design trends, like the idea of startup graphic design and corporate minimalism and those sort of like soulless little blob people, you know, those ones that we see in a lot of millennial offices and in a lot of Silicon Valley startup culture that emphasizes that bootstrap ideal. Now, instead of using those sorts of images, Gen Z has taken to mocking them. The resurgence in the sort of old money, New England type of preppy actually also represents a rejection of the bootstrap ideology. It's not a rejection of romanticizing wealth, obviously, it's definitely a romanticization of wealth, but it's a romanticization of wealth with the acknowledgement that that wealth is unearned. Old money aesthetic is generally placed in opposition to the new money aesthetic, or the sort of Kardashian, California, looks life that implies that the person using or spending the money generally has earned that money in a sort of way that they're going to frame as bootstrappy, even if they inherited it, like think Elon Musk. Now, the old money aesthetic is one that rejects bootstrap ideology by completely throwing out the window the idea that you could have even have this money without inheriting. It acknowledges inheritance and it acknowledges family wealth, as opposed to claiming that people that don't have this wealth aren't working hard enough. However, it praises this wealth and generally views this wealth quite uncritically, and rather than discussing the different exploitative ways in which those people's totem ancestor, for lack of a better term, had come into that money, people who utilise and enjoy the old money aesthetic tend to, in general, simply praise this lifestyle or say that they wish that they had been born a Kennedy and whatnot, rather than focusing on the system. The old money aesthetic acknowledges, however, the system. The rise of such micro-Gen Z aesthetics as indie sleaze and frazzled English woman parallel are the similarities in our experiences to the experiences of people during the 2008 financial crisis, in which such trends originally re-emerged or emerged. These styles de-emphasize flexing or flaunting wealth. They emphasize a more undone look, and they utilize darker colors to reflect a more somber mood. Now, on the opposite end of the color spectrum, we have the Rookie magazine teen witch aesthetic as something I'm calling, or at least hoping for. Rookie magazine was founded in 2011 as part of a collaboration by Tavi Jevinson, English fashion blogger who started when she was like 12, and the former editor of Sassy magazine, whose name I will put. Rookie magazine was a by teenage girls for teenage girls fashion, culture, and music and lifestyle magazine that amassed sort of a large following of young women in the early 2010s. The magazine closed in 2018, but I will link its archives down below because I think they're fantastic, and to give you an idea of the aesthetic and the vibe that they inspired in their following of young women. Though it was centered around fashion and style, these style rookies would hold meetups and introduce DIYs and advocate for feminist causes, creating an early community in the 2010s that was centered and created entirely by women. The main ethos of the Rookie magazine was an ethos of do-it-yourself by teenage girls for teenage girls. They wrote many articles that spoke to teenage girls' experiences, and they had a yearbook at the end of each year where they would feature some members of their community. They also offered playlists, many of which included a lot of Riot Grrrl. Now, Riot Grrrl was a music genre that formed in the early 90s when a lot of women, namely Kathleen Hanna, who went on to form Bikini Kill, were sick of just the insane amounts of maleness in the punk rock space at the time. And so these women in the Pacific Northwest generally formed their own bands and used their voices and their talent and work to advocate for feminist causes, and kind of at a time when the world had forgotten the word feminism, brought it back closer to the mainstream and inspired bands like Nirvana and Toll. These DIYs were obviously very affordable in the time following the 2008 financial crisis. And so being able to work with a community of other women to make things for themselves and start and spread their own trends was very important for these style rookies. I'm sort of calling this one perhaps a little bit early, because I know that we are in this introduction stage of the late 2000s, early 2010s, within that 20-year macro trend cycle, and also just because I love the vibe. It's something that I think is both very aesthetically pleasing, but also culturally significant right now, since, as I discussed, we're going to be in need of a lot more of a DIY grassroots ethos within the fashion community, as well as perhaps bringing back some of that feminism for which Rookie magazine. Now, Rookie feminism was, unfortunately, the precursor of the late 2010s pop feminism, eyeliner so sharp it could kill a man, Beyonce is my spirit animal. No, that's not cultural appropriation feminism. I do think that the feminism that came out of the style rookie community was actually quite a bit more authentic. Obviously, as I stated before, because it was by and for young women, as well as influenced by and spreading the stories and advocacy of the Riot Grrrl scene and genre, as well as the fact that the magazine did tell a lot of the stories of some of these young women, and many of these stories were things that people weren't talking about at the time, like stories about their first period, stories about their feeling being forced to shave, and other things like that. Obviously, Rookie magazine wasn't groundbreaking, it didn't end child marriage, but it did start a conversation among a lot of younger women at the time about using the word feminism in public at a time when that was considered out of vogue, as well as listening to female musicians and artists and mirroring each other in trends rather than listening to a larger space of mostly male designers. 2008 financial crisis, obviously, meant that a lot of people couldn't afford these designers. Now, I think that we need a similar sort of ground-up feminism. I would prefer it to have a wider lens than specifically white women and speak to the situations faced by women of color. But I think that a grassroots movement of young women, by young women, and for young women is something very necessary right now, which is another reason that I'm predicting / hoping this trend will catch back on after the repeal of Roe versus Wade. If you have seen a computer or spoken to a person in the last 5 months or so, you would know that the repeal of Roe versus Wade means that states are now allowed to legislate for themselves on abortion, which means in a lot of states that it's not necessarily an issue. However, for poorer and younger people in states where trigger laws making early bans or banning it altogether have begun, it is something that is affecting us. And I'm a 20-year-old living in Texas, so
For just pennies a day, you could help this poor, privileged girl from Austin.
for those reasons, and just because I think it's cool, I think the Rookie magazine aesthetic should and will come back. Please, Tavi, we can't afford designer clothes and we have no rights. It's the perfect time.